What happens when a person has absolute power, but is still just a person? What happens when their private grief, strange habits, or deep-seated insecurities can command an entire nation? How does a servant say no to a queen who wants to travel with her husband's corpse? Or one who demands a fake peasant village be built so she can pretend to be a milkmaid? Or one who insists that her dead husband's clothes be laid out every morning for 40 years? The lives of royalty are often strange. The lives of those who served them were even stranger. They were the ones who had to make the bizarre reality every single day. Number 21. Why did a queen force her entire world to grieve with her? A dead man had his clothes laid out by a valet every morning for 40 years. His hot water for shaving was delivered to his empty room without fail. An entire empire was plunged into a state of perpetual mourning, all because one woman could not let go. The Queen Victoria was not supposed to be a romantic. She was a monarch. Her marriage to her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was a political arrangement, like most royal weddings. But something unexpected happened. They fell deeply, passionately in love. Victoria was utterly dependent on him. He was not just her husband, he was her chief advisor, her private secretary, her closest friend, and the center of her universe. He organized the household, managed the estates, guided her on political matters, and fathered their 9 children. He was, in her own words, her all in all. Then, in December 1861, he died. He was only 42 years old. The official cause was typhoid fever. For Victoria, the world ended. Her grief was not a quiet, private affair. It was a cataclysmic event that she imposed on her family, her court, and her country. Her demands were absolute, and they were bizarre. The first and most visible demand was the color black. Victoria wore black every day for the rest of her life until her own death in 1901. But she did not grieve alone. She demanded her entire court do the same. Ladies in waiting, maids, footmen, ministers, everyone had to wear somber mourning attire. This wasn't for a few weeks or months, the standard mourning period. This was for years, which turned into decades. The royal court, once a place of vibrant colors and lavish balls, became a silent, shadowy world of black crepe and jet jewelry. Laughter was forbidden. Music was somber. Any hint of frivolity was seen as a personal insult to the queen's grief. Servants had to navigate this oppressive atmosphere daily. Imagine the psychological toll. You could not smile too widely. You could not speak too loudly. You were living and working inside a mausoleum where the chief mourner was also your absolute ruler. The smallest infraction, a brightly colored ribbon accidentally worn, could lead to a furious reprimand or even dismissal. But the demands went far beyond clothing. They became a series of strange, daily rituals designed to keep Albert's memory, his very presence, alive. Every single morning, a valet would go into Albert's untouched bedroom at Windsor Castle. He would lay out the prince consort's clothes for the day, just as he had when Albert was alive. His shaving kit was prepared, complete with hot water. Fresh towels were placed by the basin. This macabre pantomime was repeated every day for 4 decades. The servants were not just maintaining a room, they were ordered to act as if its occupant had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. The same was true at all the royal residences. Albert's rooms were kept exactly as he had left them, frozen in time. Her books remained open on his desks, inkwells were kept fresh, his portraits and busts were everywhere. Victoria would often speak to them as if he were there. Servants had to dust these shrines, clean them, and maintain them, all while pretending it was perfectly normal. They were complicit in the queen's delusion because their jobs depended on it. This wasn't just eccentricity. It was a manifestation of control. Victoria could not control death, so she controlled everything and everyone around her to an obsessive degree. Her grief became her identity. She signed her letters as the broken-hearted widow. It was also a powerful political tool. By withdrawing from public life and wrapping herself in this impenetrable shroud of mourning, she became almost untouchable. How could ministers argue with a woman so consumed by sorrow? Her demands, no matter how strange, were framed as the wishes of a heartbroken woman, and no one dared to refuse. The servants were the cogs in this strange machine of grief. The valets, the maids, the footmen, they were the ones who carried the hot water, laid out the clothes, and maintained the silent, dusty rooms. They lived the reality of the queen's demands. For them, it wasn't a symbol of a nation's sorrow. It was a bizarre, repetitive, and emotionally draining job they just had to go along with every single day for 40 long years. Number 20, how could a queen make a limp fashionable? A queen developed a limp from a stiff knee. Soon, hundreds of women in high society were deliberately walking with a limp. They ordered specially made shoes with one high heel and one low heel to perfect the imitation. This wasn't a medical necessity, it was a fashion statement. Alexandra of Denmark was the Princess of Wales, married to the future King Edward VII. She was a style icon of the late 19th century. Her fashion choices were copied across the British Empire. She was celebrated for her beauty, her grace, and her elegant dress sense. But her life was also marked by personal challenges. One of the most significant was a severe bout of rheumatic fever in 1867, which left her with a permanently stiffened knee and a noticeable limp. For most people, a physical ailment would be something to hide or overcome. For Alexandra, a public figure whose every move was scrutinized, it could have been a social disaster. But she was the Princess of Wales, and she handled it in a remarkable way. She didn't hide it. She continued to appear at public events, walking with what became her characteristic gait. What happened next was truly strange. Instead of becoming an object of pity, her limp became an object of imitation. The ladies of the court and the upper echelons of society, always desperate to emulate the princess, began to copy her walk. It became known as the Alexandra limp. This wasn't a subtle thing. Women who were perfectly healthy would deliberately affect a limp to appear more fashionable, more like their beloved princess. This placed a bizarre demand on an entire industry of servants and craftspeople. Dressmakers had to adjust hemlines to accommodate the new, uneven way of walking. But the most specific demand was placed on shoemakers. To achieve the perfect Alexandra limp, women started ordering shoes with mismatched heels. One shoe would have a heel that was significantly higher than the other, forcing the wearer into an artificial limp. Imagine being a royal shoemaker. You receive an order from a duchess or a countess for a pair of exquisite, expensive shoes, but with the bizarre specification that one heel must be 2 inches taller than the other. Your job is not to question, but to create. So you do. And soon, it's not just one order, it's dozens. The workshops of London's finest cobblers were suddenly producing these intentionally unbalanced shoes. It was a trend that made no logical sense, yet it was driven by the immense power of royal influence. The servants in these grand houses had a front row seat to this absurdity. A lady's maid would have to help her mistress dress, lacing up boots that she knew were designed to make walking difficult and uncomfortable. Footmen would watch as a parade of aristocratic ladies entered a ballroom, all bobbing up and down with the same affected gait. They had to maintain their composure to act as if this were the most normal thing in the world. The demand wasn't spoken. Alexandra never commanded anyone to limp, but her status created an unspoken imperative. To be in favor, to be seen as fashionable, you had to follow her lead, even if it meant physically altering the way you walked. It was a powerful demonstration of the soft power of royalty. Her personal struggle became a trend. The Alexandra limp eventually faded, as all fads do, but for a time it was a very real, very strange phenomenon. It forced servants, from the cobblers in their workshops to the maids in the dressing rooms, to participate in a collective and frankly ridiculous performance. They had to go along with a demand that was never officially made, but was felt by everyone in the orbit of the princess. They had to help the perfectly healthy women of high society pretend they had a disability, all in the name of fashion. Number 19, could a queen's obsession with her waistline reshape a court? Her waist measured a mere 19.5 inches, a dimension maintained through tightly laced corsets worn for hours. She ate little more than broth and the occasional orange. Her daily exercise routine lasted for hours, performed in a private gymnasium equipped with rings and pommel horses. This wasn't an athlete. This was an empress. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known affectionately as Sisi, was a woman obsessed. Married to Emperor Franz Joseph I at just 16, she was thrust into the rigid, suffocating world of the Habsburg court in Vienna. She felt trapped, and she found one thing she could control with absolute authority: her own body. This control manifested in a series of demands that ruled the lives of those who served her. Her primary obsession was her waist. Sisi was famous for her beauty, and at the center of this beauty was her impossibly slender figure. Achieving and maintaining it was her life's work. This started every morning with a ritual that was an ordeal for both the Empress and her maids. The process of lacing her corset took, by some accounts, over an hour. Her maids of honor, who were chosen for their strength as much as their aristocratic background, had to pull the laces with all their might. Sisi would hold onto a specially installed bar for leverage. The goal was to cinch her waist to a circumference that was, by any medical standard, dangerously small. The maids performing this task were under immense pressure. If the lacing was not tight enough, the Empress would be displeased. If it was too tight, she could faint or have trouble breathing. It was a delicate, stressful operation that started their day every day. They were physically manipulating the Empress's body to meet her own extreme demands. Then there was the food. Or rather, the lack of it. Sisi's diet was legendary for its austerity. She often subsisted on clear soup, raw milk, and the juice of pressed beefsteaks. She would go through periods of eating only oranges or other specific fruits. The royal kitchens, accustomed to preparing lavish multi-course banquets, were given a bizarre new set of orders. Chefs who had trained their entire lives to create complex pastries and rich sauces were now tasked with pressing the juice from 6 pounds of raw beef to fill a single porcelain cup for the Empress. Imagine being a royal chef, presenting this bloody, lukewarm liquid to your ruler. It was a complete subversion of your craft. The kitchen staff had to manage 2 entirely different menus: the rich traditional fare for the emperor and the rest of the court, and the strange Spartan concoctions for Elisabeth. Her demands dictated a separate, secret culinary world within the palace. Her third demand was on her time, and therefore the time of her attendants. She was fanatically devoted to exercise. Palaces were retrofitted with private gymnasiums. She would spend hours on gymnastic rings or riding horses. Her daily walks were not leisurely strolls. They were forced marches that could last for 6 or 7 hours, often at a pace that left her ladies in waiting completely exhausted. These women, chosen from the highest nobility, were expected to keep up with her regardless of the weather or their own physical fitness. They would return to the palace muddy and breathless, while the 50-year-old Empress still seemed full of energy. Sisi's demands were not about malice. They were born from a deep unhappiness and a desperate need for control in a life where she had very little. But the impact on her servants was profound. They were her enablers: the maids who laced her corsets, the chefs who juiced her raw meat, the ladies in waiting who were dragged on grueling hikes. They all had to participate in her obsessive rituals. Their work was not just to serve, but to facilitate a queen's dangerous, lifelong obsession with her own body. They had to go along with it because the alternative was to displease an empress, a woman who held their entire world in her tightly laced grip. Number 18. What if a queen demanded that nothing ever change? For over 50 years, the court's daily schedule did not change by so much as a minute. The queen and her 2 eldest daughters would sit and do needlework from 10 p.m. until 11 p.m. every single night. If a lady in waiting made a mistake in court etiquette, she could be publicly scolded by the queen. Life was a script, and everyone had to stick to their lines. Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III of Great Britain, was a queen who found comfort in rigid, unyielding routine. While her husband's reign was marked by political upheaval and his own personal battles with mental illness, Charlotte's court was an island of absolute, suffocating predictability. Her main demand was simple and all-encompassing: that every day be exactly like the last. This wasn't a general preference for order. It was a minute-by-minute tyranny of the schedule. Life at Windsor or Kew Palace was governed by the clock. Meals were served at the exact same time every day. Walks were taken at the same time. along the same paths. Social gatherings began and ended with military precision. For the servants and courtiers, this meant their lives were programmed. There was no room for spontaneity or error. A footman knew that at precisely 8:02 a.m., he had to be in a specific hallway waiting for a specific bell. A lady-in-waiting knew that she had to be ready with the Queen's shawl at 3:15 p.m., not 3:14 or 3:16. This level of precision required immense mental effort and discipline. A single mistake, a moment's forgetfulness, could disrupt the entire fragile ecosystem of the court and earn the Queen's formidable displeasure. Charlotte's demands were especially focused on her ladies-in-waiting. These were high-born women, but they were essentially high-status servants. Their job was to be companions to the Queen, and that meant being participants in her monotonous routine. The novelist and diarist Fanny Burney, who served as second keeper of the robes to Queen Charlotte for 5 years, left a detailed account of this life. She described it as a form of imprisonment. One of the most rigid rituals was the evening drawing room. After dinner, the royal family and the court would assemble. The etiquette was incredibly strict. You had to stand for hours. You could not speak unless spoken to by the Queen. You had to stand in a specific way, hold your hands in a specific way, and never, ever turn your back on royalty, meaning you had to back out of a room. For servants, this meant moving through these formal spaces like ghosts, always aware of where the royals were, always trying to remain invisible while performing their duties. The most telling detail of Charlotte's demand for routine was the evening needlework session. Every night, from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m., without fail, Charlotte and her older daughters would sit together and do their needlework or knotting. Their ladies-in-waiting were required to be there, sitting in silence, ready to assist if a thread was dropped or a new skein of silk was needed. For 1 hour, the most powerful women in the country performed this simple, domestic task, repeating the same actions they had performed the night before and the night before that for years on end. Why this obsession with routine? For Charlotte, it was likely a coping mechanism. Her husband's mental state was unpredictable and often chaotic. The world outside the palace was changing rapidly, with revolutions in America and France. By controlling her immediate environment with an iron will, she could create a feeling of stability and safety. But for her servants and attendants, it was a life of crushing boredom and high anxiety. They were living in a time loop created by the Queen's need for security. They had to suppress their own personalities, their own desires for variety, and become actors in her unchanging play, as they had to go along with the demand that today must be exactly like yesterday, and that tomorrow would be exactly the same. It was a strange, silent form of tyranny, the tyranny of the clock. Number 17, could a queen isolate an entire nation on a whim? She banned foreign trade, foreign education, and foreign religion. She forced her subjects into massive labor projects, building a new capital city with nothing but their bare hands. Tens of thousands died performing these tasks. Her goal was absolute self-sufficiency, a nation completely sealed off from the outside world. Rana Valona was the Queen of Madagascar from 1828 to 1861. Her reign is one of the most remarkable and brutal in modern history. After the death of her husband, who had been open to European influence, Rana Valona seized power and immediately reversed his policies. Her core demand was a radical form of isolationism. She wanted Madagascar to be for the Malagasy people alone, free from any and all foreign contamination. This was not a gentle policy of non-engagement. It was an aggressive, paranoid, and total severing of ties with the outside world. And it placed incredible demands on her people, who were effectively her servants on a national scale. First, she systematically dismantled the work of European missionaries. She banned Christianity, making public profession of the faith a capital offense. She closed the schools that missionaries had built. This meant that an entire generation was cut off from the education and ideas that had begun to filter into the island. Next, she turned on trade. She canceled treaties with Britain and France and expelled foreign traders. Her demand was that Madagascar would produce everything it needed for itself. This policy of autarky was ambitious, but the reality was incredibly harsh. Without foreign goods, the country had to reinvent its own industries from scratch. The demand fell on the ordinary people. They were forced to work in newly created factories, often under brutal conditions, to produce goods like soap, sugar, and rum that were previously imported. The most extreme demand was her use of fanapuana, a traditional form of forced labor. Essentially, the queen could demand unpaid labor from her subjects for any project she deemed necessary. And she deemed many projects necessary. She decided to build a new, grander capital city. She embarked on massive public works. And the people were her workforce. Vast numbers of Malagasy people were conscripted and forced to march for miles to work sites. They had to quarry stone, haul massive timber beams from the forests, and construct elaborate buildings, all without pay and with very little food. The conditions were appalling, disease was rampant, accidents were common. The death toll from these projects was staggering, with some estimates suggesting that up to a third of the laborers on some projects perished. Imagine being a farmer, living a simple life in your village. One day the queen's soldiers arrive, and you are ordered to leave your family and your land. You are forced to walk for a week to a construction site where you will work from dawn until dusk, hauling rocks until the project is finished, or you collapse from exhaustion. This was the reality for thousands. Her servants within the palace were not immune. They lived in a state of constant fear. The queen was known for her volatile temper and her belief in traditional justice, which included trial by ordeal. Her court was a place of intrigue and suspicion. The slightest misstep could be interpreted as treason. Ranavallona's demand for total self-sufficiency was driven by a fierce desire to protect her kingdom's sovereignty from encroaching European powers. From her perspective, she was a patriot, a strong leader resisting colonialism, but the cost of her vision was borne by her people. They were the ones who had to labor, to suffer, and to die to make her dream of an isolated, self-reliant Madagascar a reality. They had no choice but to go along with the demands of a queen who was willing to sacrifice almost anything and anyone for the sake of her nation's absolute independence. Number 16, would you be a queen's footstool? A visiting European dignitary was granted an audience. He entered the room to find the queen holding court. When she wished to sit, she did not look for a chair. Instead, she gestured to one of her male servants, who got down on all fours. The queen then sat on his back for the duration of the lengthy meeting. This was Queen Nzinga of Mbande, a 17th century ruler of the Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms in what is now Angola. She was a brilliant and ruthless diplomat and military strategist who spent decades resisting Portuguese colonial expansion. She was known for her intelligence, her political savvy, and her utterly intimidating presence, and she knew how to use spectacle to project power. The demand to use a servant as a human chair was not about a lack of furniture. It was a calculated act of political theater. The story, recorded by a Dutch chronicler, illustrates one of Nzinga's most powerful demands, that her authority be recognized as absolute and that her rivals, particularly the Europeans, be put in their place. Let's break down the scene. The Portuguese governor, representing a powerful colonial empire, arrives to negotiate a treaty. He is likely full of his own importance, representing the King of Portugal. He is shown into Nzinga's presence. The Portuguese had brought a chair for their governor, but they offered none to Nzinga. This was a subtle, or not so subtle, insult. It implied that he was there to preside over the meeting while she was the supplicant. Nzinga's response was masterful. Instead of demanding a chair, which would have been a sign of weakness, she made a quiet gesture. One of her attendants immediately understood. He knelt down, positioning himself as a human seat. Nzinga then gracefully sat on his back, placing her at the same eye level as the seated Portuguese governor. In one single, silent action, she turned the tables. She demonstrated that her power was so complete, her command so absolute, that the bodies of her people were hers to use as she saw fit. She showed the governor that while he needed a physical object to sit on, her authority provided her with a living throne. She was not his equal, she was superior. Now consider the servant. His name is lost to history. Okay? What was his experience? This was not likely a punishment. In the context of Nzinga's court, this was probably a position of honor. To be chosen to be the queen's physical support, her throne, in front of a foreign adversary was a sign of immense trust. He was not just a piece of furniture, he was an active participant in a display of power. His role required physical strength, discipline, and the ability to remain perfectly still for a long period, all while a historic negotiation was taking place literally on top of him. He could not fidget, he could not complain. He had to become an unmoving symbol of his queen's power. This demand was part of a larger pattern. Nzinga constantly challenged traditional gender roles and European expectations. She often dressed in men's clothing. She maintained a large retinue of male wives. She insisted on being called king, not queen. Every one of these acts was a demand that people see her not as a woman, but as a ruler, unbound by conventional rules. Her servants had to adapt to this fluid and often shocking world. They had to be ready for anything. One day their duty might be to serve a meal. The next, it might be to act as a piece of furniture during a diplomatic summit. They had to understand the symbolic meaning behind her actions and play their part perfectly. Nzinga's demand for a human chair was weird, certainly. But it was not frivolous. It was a deadly serious political statement. It was a way of communicating her power without saying a word. And for the servant who knelt on the floor that day, his job was to go along with it, to lend his body to the cause, and to help his queen win a battle of wits against a colonial empire. Number 15, what if a queen demanded to remake the language? A ruler decided that the existing written language was insufficient to describe her greatness, so she simply ordered new words to be invented. Scholars were commanded to create new Chinese characters, complex and ornate, with the sole purpose of being used in her name and to describe her reign. These new characters were then forced into official documents across the nation. This was the demand of Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. She was a brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless figure who rose from being a concubine to founding her own dynasty, the Zhou, in 690 AD. She shattered millennia of tradition, and she wanted a new language to reflect her new reality. The Chinese writing system is ancient and deeply revered. To alter it is a profound act. But Wu Zetian was not one for subtlety. Early in her reign, she and her supporters began the process of creating what are known as the Zichin characters. The original character meant to shine or illuminate. The new character she had created was incredibly complex. It was composed of the characters for sun and moon, placed above the character for sky. The implication was clear. She was not just shining on the earth, she was the sun and moon shining from above the very sky itself. She was a cosmic entity. This placed a huge demand on the entire bureaucracy of China. Every scribe, every official, every scholar in the empire had to learn this new, complicated character. All official documents, imperial edicts, historical records, and court correspondence now had to use this new character whenever her name was written. To use the old character was not just a mistake, it was a political act. It was a sign of disrespect, a subtle rebellion against her authority, and it could have severe consequences. Imagine being a provincial scribe hundreds of miles from the capital. You have spent your life mastering the thousands of complex characters of your language. One day a decree arrives. You must now forget the character for the emperor's name that you have always known and learn this new artificial symbol. Your hand has to learn a new pattern, your memory has to be retrained, and you know that a mistake could cost you your job, or worse. The demands didn't stop with her name. Other new characters were created to replace common words like year, month, day, and ruler. Each one was designed to be more auspicious or to carry a meaning that reinforced her legitimacy and power. The character for ruler was redesigned to be larger and more imposing. The character for year was changed to include the character for eternity. This was a massive nationwide re-education campaign enforced from the top down. Scholars in the Imperial Academy had to write new dictionaries. Tutors had to teach the new characters to their students. The servants who managed the Imperial Library had to be aware of the changes, ensuring that new documents used the correct forms. Why did she do this? It was a masterful act of propaganda. By changing The very words used to describe her rule. She was attempting to control thought itself. She was embedding her personal brand directly into the written language. It was a way of saying that her reign was so revolutionary, so unprecedented, that the old words were no longer good enough. She was not just another emperor in a long line. She was the beginning of a new era, an era that required a new vocabulary. The Zicheng characters did not last. After her reign ended and the Tang dynasty was restored, the bureaucracy quickly and quietly reverted to the traditional characters. They were a fascinating but short-lived experiment. But for the 15 years that Wu Zetian sat on the dragon throne, her servants, from the highest minister to the humblest scribe, had to go along with her audacious demand. They had to learn a new way to write, all because their queen decided she needed a language as unique as she was. Number 14, why would a queen hide a secret that was killing her? She suffered from an umbilical hernia for years, a condition made worse by 11 pregnancies. The pain was often excruciating. Yet she told no one but her husband. She demanded that her ladies-in-waiting, who dressed her every day, ignore the large, obvious swelling on her abdomen. They were expected to see nothing, say nothing, and act as if everything was perfectly normal. Caroline of Ansbach was the wife of King George II of Great Britain. She was one of the most intelligent and politically influential queen consorts in British history. She was a master politician, a patron of the arts and sciences, and the de facto ruler of the country when her husband was away. But she harbored a secret that required a bizarre conspiracy of silence from her servants. Sometime in the 1720s, Caroline developed an umbilical hernia. This was a common and dangerous condition in an age before modern surgery, especially for women who had been through multiple childbirths. It was painful and it was disfiguring, but for Queen Caroline, it was above all a weakness, and she was a woman who could not afford to show any weakness at court. Her primary demand was absolute secrecy. The only person she confided in was the king. Even her personal physicians were kept in the dark for years. This created an extraordinary situation for her ladies-in-waiting and her dressers. These were the women who saw the queen in her most private moments. They helped her bathe, they helped her dress, they laced her stays. They could not have failed to notice the hernia. Yet, they were bound by an unspoken command: you will not acknowledge this. Imagine the daily tension of this ritual. A maid is lacing the queen's stays, her hands working around the painful swelling. Both women are acutely aware of it, but both must pretend it does not exist. The maid cannot ask if the queen is in pain. She cannot suggest a looser garment. She must perform her duties as if she is dressing a perfectly healthy body. It was a form of psychological torture, a daily performance of denial. The queen's wardrobe had to be managed to conceal the problem. Dressmakers had to be given instructions for clothes that were fashionable, yet cleverly designed to hide the swelling, all without being told the real reason for the specific cuts and drapes. They were working around a secret they were not supposed to know. Why such secrecy? The 18th century court was a viper's nest of gossip and political intrigue. Any sign of physical infirmity could be used by her enemies to suggest she was weak, unfit, or losing her influence over the king. Her power depended on an image of robust health and unflagging energy. Admitting to a condition that was considered unseemly would have been a political catastrophe. It would have been fodder for satirists and a weapon for her political opponents. The deception was maintained for over a decade. But in November 1737, the hernia ruptured. The secret could no longer be kept. The queen was suddenly taken violently ill. Finally, surgeons were called in. When they examined her, they were horrified. The condition was far advanced and had become strangulated. Even on her deathbed, her concern was for control and decorum. As the surgeons performed a series of brutal, hopeless operations without anesthetic, she calmly discussed philosophy and politics. Her ladies-in-waiting, who had spent years pretending not to see her illness, now had to tend to her as she died from it. They had been loyal participants in a deception that ultimately contributed to her death. If she had sought help earlier, she might have survived. Her final demand, in a way, was that her servants help her die with the same dignity and control she had lived with. They had to go along with a bizarre and dangerous charade for years. They kept a queen's secret, a secret that was plain to see every time they helped her dress, all because their queen's power depended on the illusion of a perfect, healthy body. Number 13, how do you prepare a nursery for a ghost? The court was officially informed that the queen was pregnant. The royal nursery was prepared. Wet nurses were hired and kept on standby. A team of high-ranking officials was assembled to witness the birth. Proclamations were drafted announcing the arrival of a royal heir. There was just one problem: there was no baby, and there never was going to be one. This was the strange reality of Queen Mary I's court in 1555. Mary, the first queen regnant of England, was desperate for an heir. She was a devout Catholic, and she needed a Catholic successor to secure her religious reformation of the country. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was supposed to provide this heir. In the autumn of 1554, it seemed her prayers had been answered. Mary's doctors confirmed she was pregnant. Her abdomen began to swell. She experienced what she believed to be morning sickness and the quickening, the first fetal movements. The court and the country began to celebrate. Letters were sent to European courts announcing the happy news. The demand on her servants and the entire court was to act as if this pregnancy was completely real. This went far beyond simple well wishes. It was a full-scale, state-level preparation for a royal birth. The Queen went into traditional confinement at Hampton Court Palace in April 1555 as her due date approached. This meant she retired from public view, attended only by her ladies in waiting and medical staff. A magnificent cradle, a gift from her father Henry V, was brought out and placed in the newly furnished nursery. Dozens of servants were assigned to the nursery, tasked with keeping it clean, warm, and ready at a moment's notice. A specific group of high-born ladies were chosen to be rockers of the cradle. It was a prestigious position. Their sole job was to be ready to rock the royal baby to sleep. Wet nurses were selected, women who had recently given birth themselves, and they were brought to court to live, waiting for the baby to be born so they could fulfill their duty. The political machinery was also in full swing. The council drafted the official birth announcements. One version was prepared for a boy, another for a girl. All that was needed was to fill in the date. Her ambassadors wrote excited dispatches back to their home countries. London was on tenterhooks, waiting for the church bells to ring, signaling the birth of a prince or princess. But the due date in May came and went. Nothing happened. The weeks turned into a month, then another. The atmosphere at court must have been incredibly strange and tense. The servants in the nursery were maintaining a room for a baby that did not exist. The wet nurses were waiting for a mouth they would never feed. The ladies in waiting had to continue to reassure the Queen, who was becoming increasingly anxious, that everything was fine and the baby would come soon. They had to look at her swollen belly and pretend they had no doubts. By July, it was becoming painfully clear that something was wrong. The Queen's belly began to shrink. By August, the court had to quietly accept the humiliating truth. There was no baby. It had been a phantom pregnancy, or pseudocyesis, a rare condition where a woman has all the symptoms of pregnancy without being pregnant. The nursery was dismantled. The wet nurses were sent home, their services not required. The cradle was put back in storage. The court had to pretend the whole episode never happened. But for months, every single person in the royal household, from the highest lord to the lowest scullery maid, had been required to participate in a collective delusion. They had to plan for, celebrate, and build a world for a child who was never conceived. Their jobs, and in the volatile world of Tudor politics, possibly their lives, depended on going along with the Queen's desperate and ultimately heartbreaking wish. And number 12, did a queen really brag about only bathing twice? A queen famously declared she had only bathed twice in her life, on the day she was born and the day she was married. This story has been repeated for centuries, painting her as a symbol of medieval filth. But the reality of her demands on her servants was far more complex, and in some ways, far more stringent. The queen in question is Isabella I of Castile, one of the most powerful and influential monarchs in Spanish history. She sponsored Christopher Columbus, completed the Reconquista of Spain, and established the Spanish Inquisition. The story about her bathing habits is almost certainly a myth, likely a piece of propaganda spread by her enemies. But it points to a different truth about her world. While personal hygiene by modern standards was poor, Isabella's demands were focused on a different kind of purity, religious and ideological purity. The servants in Isabella's court lived under a regime of intense religious scrutiny. Isabella was fervently, and at times fanatically, Catholic. She saw it as her divine mission to create a purely Catholic Spain. This translated into a series of demands that governed the private lives of everyone around her, from her highest courtiers to her kitchen staff. One of the most significant demands was the absolute adherence to Catholic rituals. Attendance at Mass was not optional. Fasting on holy days was strictly enforced. Any servant who was suspected of not being a true believer was in a dangerous position. This was particularly true for conversos, those who had converted from Judaism or Islam to Christianity. Isabella and her husband Ferdinand established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478. While its primary targets were outside the palace walls, the atmosphere of suspicion and fear it created permeated the court. A servant could be denounced for making an offhand remark, for not seeming pious enough, or for being seen associating with the wrong people. Imagine the paranoia. A quiet conversation in a hallway could be overheard and misinterpreted. A kitchen maid who failed to prepare a meal according to strict Christian dietary laws could be accused of secretly practicing another faith. The demand was not just to act like a good Catholic, but to be one, heart and soul, and the Queen's confessors and officials were always watching. They were, in effect, a spiritual police force within the court. Another of Isabella's major demands was for austerity and decorum. Despite the immense wealth pouring into Spain from its expanding empire, her court was not a place of frivolous luxury. She demanded that her ladies-in-waiting dress modestly. She frowned upon lavish spending and decadent behavior. This meant that servants had to maintain a court that was simultaneously powerful and grand, yet also somber and pious. The tone was set from the top. So, while the story of her not bathing is likely false, it misses the point. Isabella's servants might not have been ordered to draw her a bath every day, but they were subject to a far more invasive set of demands. They had to constantly perform their piety, they had to watch what they said and who they spoke to, they had to navigate a world where a religious misstep could have devastating consequences. The real weird demand of Isabella was not about personal hygiene. It was the demand for total ideological conformity. She was obsessed with cleansing the kingdom, not with soap and water, but through faith and fire. Her servants had to go along with this. They had to live and work in an environment where their very souls were considered the Queen's business, and where the price of failing to meet her standard of purity was terrifyingly high. Number 11. Could a queen give up a throne for a book? She refused to marry, declaring herself married to philosophy. She demanded to be educated like a man, studying for 10 hours a day. And she caused a scandal by dressing in men's clothing. And then, at the height of her power, she did the most shocking thing of all. She gave up her throne, all so she could be free to live the life of an intellectual in Rome. Queen Christina of Sweden was one of the most brilliant and unconventional monarchs of the 17th century. She inherited the throne as a child and grew into a formidable ruler. But her demands were not for land or power in the traditional sense. Were for knowledge, freedom, and a life of the mind, and they completely baffled her court and her servants. From a young age, Christina rejected the role that was expected of her. Her primary demand was for an education equal to, or greater than, any prince in Europe. Her father had insisted she be raised as a boy would have been. She spent her days studying languages, philosophy, mathematics, and religion, often to the point of exhaustion. Her tutors and servants were required to facilitate this relentless pursuit of knowledge. This meant keeping the royal library perfectly organized, finding rare books, and ensuring the Queen's study schedule was never, ever interrupted. Her days were not filled with the typical courtly pastimes of needlework or music. They were a grueling academic regimen. For her servants, this meant their queen was an eccentric and demanding scholar. She would summon them at all hours to fetch a book or discuss a philosophical point. She cared little for sleep and expected her attendants to keep the same punishing hours. Christina also defied all conventions of royal femininity. She had a deep voice, preferred practical, often masculine clothing, and took up activities like riding and hunting with a passion. Her dressers were not tasked with creating elaborate gowns, but with providing her with the simple, functional attire she preferred. Her ladies-in-waiting were not companions for gossip, but an audience for her intellectual pronouncements. Strange and confusing court to serve in. The greatest pressure on Christina was to marry and provide an heir. This was the fundamental duty of a monarch, but Christina refused. She had no interest in marriage or children. Her demand was to be left alone, to remain a virgin queen, not for political reasons like Elizabeth I, but out of a personal and intellectual choice. This caused a major political crisis. Her counselors, her nobles, and her people all begged her to marry. She would not budge. Then came her most bizarre and world-shaking demand. In 1654, at the age of 27, she decided to abdicate. She was tired of ruling. The responsibilities of state were, to her, a tedious distraction from her real work studying and collecting art. She wanted to move to Rome, the center of the intellectual and artistic world, and live as a private citizen. Imagine the shock this sent through her court. A queen was willingly giving up absolute power. Her servants, whose entire lives and livelihoods were tied to her, were suddenly faced with an uncertain future. They had served a queen who demanded books over balls, philosophy over politics, and now she was demanding to be a queen no longer. The abdication process was complex. She had to secure a pension, arrange for a cousin to succeed her, and plan her journey south. Her servants were responsible for the logistics of this unprecedented event. They had to pack her vast collection of books and art, the true treasures she cared about, for shipment to Rome. Christina's life was a series of weird demands, all stemming from her refusal to be the queen she was expected to be. She demanded to be a scholar, a man of action, a free thinker, and finally she demanded the right to not be a queen at all. Her servants had to navigate the whims of a genius who found the crown of Sweden to be little more than a bothersome hat, getting in the way of a good book. Number 10. How do you police a nation's private life? A queen set up a secret police force with a very specific mission. They were not hunting spies or political dissidents. They were hunting for adulterers, gamblers, and anyone deemed to be living an immoral life. This castity commission had agents across the land snooping into the private affairs of both nobles and commoners, all on the queen's orders. Maria Theresa was the formidable ruler of the Habsburg Empire in the 18th century. She was a devout Catholic, a mother of 16 children, and a woman with a very strict sense of morality. And she was not content to simply live by her own moral code. She demanded that her entire empire live by it too. Her most peculiar and invasive tool for enforcing this was the Keisheitskommission or Chastity Commission. This was a real state-sanctioned body of secret police. Their job was to enforce public morality as the Empress defined it. This meant they were, in effect, the bedroom police. The commission's agents were tasked with rooting out any and all forms of behavior that Maria Theresa considered sinful. This included adultery, premarital relationships, and any other immoral conduct. They would raid balls, inns, and private homes where they suspected illicit activities were taking place. They were empowered to arrest people on the spot. This placed an extraordinary demand on the people who worked for the state, from the police themselves to the local officials. Imagine being a police officer in Vienna. Your duties now include bursting into a private party to check if the dancing is too suggestive or if unmarried couples are spending too much time alone. You are enforcing the Queen's personal sense of propriety. The commission's reach was long. They had informants everywhere. A servant in a noble house could be an informant, reporting on the master's late-night visitors. A neighbor could report on another neighbor. It created an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust where private lives were no longer private. The punishments were severe. Women found guilty of immoral behavior could have their heads shaved and be forced to sweep the streets. Some were even exiled to remote parts of the empire. Men could be fined, imprisoned, or forced into the military. The demand extended to the Queen's own children. Maria Theresa was a loving but incredibly controlling mother. She had a network of spies who reported on her children's every move even after they were married and living in other countries. Her daughter, Marie Antoinette, the future Queen of France, was constantly bombarded with letters from her mother, scolding her for her frivolous lifestyle and giving her detailed instructions on how to behave. The servants in Marie Antoinette's household were often caught in the middle, trying to serve their own queen, while knowing that spies were reporting everything back to the powerful empress in Vienna. Why this obsession? Maria Theresa genuinely believed that the moral health of her empire was linked to its political and military strength. She believed that a disciplined, pious, and moral populace would make for a stronger state. She saw sin and vice as a kind of national security threat. But for the people who had to live under this regime and the servants who had to enforce it, it was a bizarre and oppressive reality. They were part of a system where the state claimed the authority to regulate the most intimate aspects of human life. The Chastity Commission was eventually disbanded, but during its existence, it represented one of the strangest demands a ruler could make: the demand to control not just the bodies and the labor of her subjects, but their moral and private lives as well. Number 9. Did a grieving queen keep rabbits for her lost children? A queen who had endured 17 pregnancies saw none of her children survive to adulthood. In her grief and loneliness, she filled her rooms with pet rabbits. She had 17 of them. She treated them like her children, talking to them and caring for them. Her servants were required to tend to these animals as if they were members of the royal family. This story belongs to Queen Anne of Great Britain, the last monarch of the Stuart dynasty. While the detail about the 17 rabbits was popularized by the film The Favourite and is not strictly historically proven, it points to a deeper truth about Anne's life and the demands her personal tragedies placed on her court. Her life was a relentless series of pregnancies, miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths. It was a private agony that played out on a public stage. The historical reality is that Queen Anne's physical and emotional suffering was immense. She was plagued by ill health, including gout so severe that she often had to be carried in a sedan chair, and she was in a near constant state of either pregnancy or mourning. Of her many pregnancies, only one child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, survived infancy. He was the hope of the nation. But he died in 1700 at the age of 11. This final crushing loss left Anne devastated, and the nation without a direct Protestant heir. Her grief was a constant, palpable presence at court. And this is where the demands on her servants come in. They had to work around a queen who was in chronic physical pain and perpetual emotional distress. One of Anne's key relationships was with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. For years, Sarah was her closest confidante and the most powerful woman at court. Anne's demand on Sarah was for constant, unwavering emotional support. Their letters reveal an intense, needy relationship. Anne begged for Sarah's affection and presence. Servants would have been the messengers for these intense, often desperate letters. They would have witnessed the emotional turmoil of their queen, her reliance on her favorite, and the eventual bitter falling out between the two women. Whether she kept rabbits or not, Anne did demand a court that could accommodate her physical limitations and her deep-seated sadness. Her mobility problems meant that court rituals had to be adapted. The palace had to be made accessible for her sedan chair or wheelchair. Servants had to be ready to lift and carry their queen. It was physically demanding work. The atmosphere at court was also heavy. Unlike the vibrant courts of other monarchs, Anne's was often subdued, reflecting her poor health and personal sorrows. There were moments of levity, and Anne did enjoy music and card games, but the shadow of her losses was always there. Her servants had to be sensitive to her moods. A misplaced comment or an overly cheerful demeanor at the wrong moment could be seen as deeply insensitive. The story of the rabbits, whether true or a later invention, serves as a powerful metaphor. It captures the image of a queen trying to fill an unimaginable void. If the story is taken as a literal demand, imagine the work involved. Servants would be responsible for feeding, cleaning, and caring for 17 royal rabbits. They would have to treat these animals with the reverence due to a royal pet, understanding that to the queen, they were far more than that. They were stand-ins for the children she had lost. Queen Anne's true demand on her servants was to help her endure a life of almost unbearable suffering. They had to support her physically, navigate her emotional fragility, and work within a court defined by loss. They had to go along with the needs of a queen whose personal tragedies had shaped not just her own life, but the future of the entire nation. Number 8. How long can you travel with a dead body? Her husband died, but she refused to believe he was truly gone. She would not allow his body to be buried. Instead, she had it embalmed and kept it with her. For 3 years, she traveled across the countryside of Spain with her husband's corpse in a coffin, ordering it to be opened periodically so she could look upon his face. This is the story of Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. She was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, and the mother of a Holy Roman Emperor. But her life was defined by one all-consuming passion, her love for her handsome husband, Philip the Fair, Duke of Burgundy. Their marriage was a political match, but for Joanna it was a true love affair. She was intensely and by all accounts obsessively in love with him. Philip, however, was a notorious womanizer, and his infidelities drove Joanna into fits of jealous rage. Their relationship was a tempest of passion and despair. In 1506, at the age of 28, Philip died suddenly from a fever. Joanna's grief was absolute, and it manifested in one of the most bizarre demands a queen has ever made. She refused to be separated from him. After a grand funeral, she did not allow the coffin to be interred. Instead, she began a macabre journey. She traveled from the city of Burgos with a huge retinue of servants and nobles, and her husband's casket always with her. This was not a short trip to a final resting place. This was a 3-year funeral procession that wandered aimlessly through the Spanish landscape. The demands on her servants were extraordinary. They were part of a mobile court of death. They traveled only at night because Joanna had decreed that a widow who has lost the son of her own soul should never expose herself to the light of day. Besides, they would rest at monasteries during the day, but she forbade the coffin from being taken to any convent or place where women were present due to her insane jealousy of Philip, even in death. Imagine being a servant on this journey. Your life is governed by the morbid whims of a grieving queen. You travel in the dark, you set up camp in cold monasteries, and your central duty is to guard and transport a coffin containing the decaying body of a prince. The most unsettling demand came periodically. Joanna would order the coffin to be opened. She would gaze at Philip's embalmed face, sometimes for hours. She would talk to him, and allegedly kiss his feet. Her servants and the clergy traveling with her had to stand by and watch this disturbing ritual. They had to assist in opening the heavy lead-lined casket. They had to endure the sight and presumably the smell. And they had to act as if it were a normal expression of grief. Was Joanna truly mad? It's a question historians still debate. Her behavior was certainly erratic, but she was also in a precarious political position. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles, wanted to rule in her place. It was in their interest to portray her as mentally unstable. Her grief-stricken procession may have been, in part, a political act away of asserting her rights as Philip's widow and the mother of his heir, refusing to let him go until his rightful inheritance was secured. Regardless of her motives, her servants had no choice but to obey. They had to go along with a journey that seemed like a descent into madness. For 3 long years, they lived in a world of darkness and grief, their lives dedicated to serving a queen who would not, and could not, say goodbye to her dead husband. Eventually her father intervened, and Joanna was confined to a convent for the rest of her life, while her son ruled in her name. But her bizarre, years-long funeral march remains one of history's strangest tales of love, grief, and royal command. Number 7. Why would a ruler want to be a man? She was the daughter of a great pharaoh. She was the wife of a pharaoh. But that wasn't enough. She wanted to be pharaoh herself, not as a regent or a queen, but as a full-fledged king. To achieve this, she demanded that she be depicted in all official art and statues as a man. complete with male clothing, a bare chest, and the traditional false beard of a pharaoh. Hatshepsut was one of the most powerful and successful rulers of ancient Egypt, reigning in the 15th century BC. But she faced one major obstacle: she was a woman. In the deeply traditional world of Egypt, the role of pharaoh was reserved for men. The king was the embodiment of the god Horus on earth. A woman could not be Horus. Hatshepsut's solution was audacious. She did not try to change the system, she changed herself, or rather, she changed her public image. Her demand was a complete visual and ideological transformation. She ordered the artisans, sculptors, and scribes of Egypt to portray her as a male king. This was a shocking and unprecedented command. Imagine being a sculptor in the royal workshops at Thebes. You have spent your life training in the strict artistic conventions of Egypt, carving images of powerful male pharaohs and graceful queens. Now you are given a new set of instructions. You are to carve the new pharaoh, Hatshepsut, but you are to give her the body of a man. You must chisel a broad, muscular chest where breasts should be. You must sculpt the short, pleated kilt of a king instead of the sheath dress of a queen. And most importantly, you must attach the ceremonial false beard, the ultimate symbol of kingship, to her chin. The demand extended to the written word as well. In early inscriptions from her reign, she is referred to with feminine pronouns, Her Majesty. But as her power grew, the language changed. Scribes were instructed to use male pronouns. They had to write His Majesty and refer to her as Son of Ra. They were literally rewriting her gender in the official records. This wasn't about personal identity in the modern sense. It was a brilliant political strategy. Hatshepsut understood that to be accepted as a legitimate ruler, she had to conform to the existing image of power. The image of power was male, so she adopted it. By presenting herself as a man, she could seamlessly fit into the long line of pharaohs who came before her. She could perform the male-centric religious rituals that were required of the king. She could command the army. Her servants and officials had to participate fully in this fiction. When addressing her in public, they would have used the masculine titles. In private, it may have been different, but in the official world of the court, she was king. Her courtiers, her priests, and her administrators all had to go along with the charade. Their careers depended on it. Hatshepsut's reign was incredibly successful. She was a prolific builder, and her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri is one of the masterpieces of ancient architecture. She oversaw a prosperous and peaceful period for Egypt. She proved that a woman could rule as effectively as any man. But the demand to be portrayed as a man had a strange backlash. After her death, her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, attempted to erase her from history. He had her name and image chiseled off monuments throughout Egypt. Statues of her as a male pharaoh were smashed and buried. It was an attempt to restore the traditional, male-only order of things. For the servants and artisans of her time, however, the demand was clear. They had to create a new reality. They had to use their chisels and their reed pens to turn a woman into a king. They had to help their queen construct a new identity, one that allowed her to rule in a world that was not ready for a female pharaoh. Number 6. Who needs 100 dishes for a single meal? Every day, 2 full meals were prepared for the ruler. Each meal consisted of over 100 different dishes. These were laid out on 6 long tables. In a spectacular display of culinary abundance, the ruler would then walk past the tables, inspect the dishes, and eat a tiny portion from just 2 or 3 of them. The rest of the food was then given to her favorite courtiers, eunuchs, and ladies-in-waiting. This was the daily dining ritual of Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who effectively ruled China for nearly 50 years during the late Qing dynasty. Her power was immense, and her lifestyle was one of almost unimaginable luxury. Her demands on the imperial kitchens were legendary. The heart of this operation was the Imperial Kitchen, a vast organization within the Forbidden City, staffed by hundreds of cooks, helpers, and eunuchs. Their sole purpose was to satisfy the culinary whims of the Empress Dowager. Cixi's demand for a 100-dish meal was not about hunger. It was about power, status, and security. The logistics of preparing such a feast twice a day were staggering. The head eunuch of the kitchen would present Siksi with a long menu written on a yellow sheet of paper. She would make her selections, but a huge number of standard dishes were always prepared regardless. The kitchen was divided into specialized departments, one for meats, one for vegetables, one for pastries, one for rice, and so on. Each department would swing into action, preparing dozens of intricate dishes simultaneously. The ingredients were the finest available, sourced from all over the Chinese Empire. Everything had to be perfect. A team of eunuchs was responsible for personally tasting every single dish before it was served to the empress. This was not for quality control. It was to check for poison. The fear of assassination was constant. When the meal was ready, it was a grand procession. Dozens of eunuchs in splendid robes would carry the lacquered boxes and porcelain dishes from the kitchens to Sixi's dining hall. The 6 tables would be filled with a dazzling array of colors, smells, and textures. There were dishes made from duck, chicken, pork, and venison. There were exotic soups, delicate pastries, and a huge variety of vegetables. Then came the ritual. Sixi would sit at her own table, and the dishes she had chosen would be placed before her. But she never ate much. It was considered undignified for a ruler to show a large appetite. After she had taken a few small bites, the meal was effectively over for her. This is when the second part of the demand came into play. The leftover food, which was virtually all of it, was a source of immense favor. Sixi would bestow dishes upon her favorite attendants. To be given a dish from the empress's table was a sign of great honor. It was a way for her to reward loyalty and play courtiers off against each other. The servants would then eat this magnificent food, which was far better than their own rations. The waste, by modern standards, was incredible, but in the logic of the imperial court, it was not waste. It was a necessary display of the dynasty's wealth and power. It showed that the empire could afford to produce this level of abundance for a single person's meal. For the hundreds of servants in the kitchen, it was a life of intense pressure. They worked long hours in hot, smoky conditions. A single mistake, a dish that was slightly burned or improperly seasoned, could result in a severe punishment. They were cogs in a massive machine designed to produce a daily spectacle that was more about theater than about food. They had to go along with the demand to cook a banquet for 100 for an audience of 1. Number 5, would you drink a pearl to win a bet? A queen made a wager with a Roman general. She bet that she could host a single banquet that cost 10 million sesterces, an astronomical sum of money. The general, Mark Antony, accepted the bet, thinking it was impossible. On the day of the banquet, the food was lavish, but not impossibly expensive. Antony was about to claim victory. The queen then made her move. She ordered her servants to bring her a cup of strong vinegar. She took off one of her earrings, which contained a massive perfect pearl, dropped it into the vinegar, and once it dissolved, she drank it. This is the legendary story of Cleopatra VII of Egypt, as told by the Roman historian Pliny the Elder. Whether it happened exactly as described is debatable, but the story perfectly captures Cleopatra's flair for the dramatic and the extraordinary demands she placed on those around her to create an aura of divine wealth and power. Let's break down the demand. This was not just a whim. It was a calculated political act. Cleopatra was trying to secure the support of Mark Antony in Rome. She needed to prove that Egypt was an incredibly wealthy and powerful ally, a prize worth having. She couldn't just tell him Egypt was rich. She had to show him in a way he would never forget. The bet itself was an act of supreme confidence. 10 million sesterces was enough to pay a legion of soldiers for a year. The demand on her staff was to create a banquet that lived up to this hype. The chefs, the stewards, the entertainers all had to perform at the highest level, but the final act was the strangest demand of all. A servant was ordered to bring a goblet, not of wine, but of strong vinegar or wine sour. This alone would have been unusual. Then, the queen, in front of her powerful guest, took off one of the crown jewels of Egypt, a pearl of immense size and value, and destroyed it. Imagine being the servant who brought that cup. You are holding a simple, acidic liquid, and you know it is about to be used to dissolve a treasure worth a fortune. You are a participant in an act of breathtakingly extravagant waste. You have to remain perfectly composed as your queen performs this act of chemical theater. The science of it is plausible. Pearls are primarily calcium carbonate, which does dissolve in a strong acid like vinegar. It would take some time, and she may have crushed it first, but the principle is sound. The effect on Antony was exactly what Cleopatra intended. He was stunned into submission. He understood the message. A queen who could afford to drink a fortune as a casual party trick was a queen who had limitless resources. She wasn't just wealthy, she was so wealthy that wealth itself was meaningless to her. It was the ultimate power move. Her servants were essential to all her spectacles. When she first met Julius Caesar, she had herself secretly delivered to his quarters rolled up in a carpet. A servant had to carry that carpet and unroll it at the perfect moment to reveal the queen. When she made her famous entrance into Tarsus to meet Antony, she arrived on a magnificent barge with a purple sail, dressed as the goddess Venus, surrounded by attendants. Her servants were not just cleaners and cooks, they were stagehands, prop masters, and supporting actors in the grand drama of her life. They had to be ready for anything. They had to procure rare items, manage complex logistics, and never, ever show surprise at their queen's bizarre and brilliant demands. Their job was to help her build her own legend. And in the case of the pearl, they had to go along with an act of destruction so audacious that it would be remembered for 2,000 years. Number 4, must a queen's party have no rules? A queen built a private palace where she could escape the rigid rules of the court. She hosted small, exclusive parties there. But there was one very strict rule. There were no rules. A sign at the entrance read, "Leave your ranks, titles, and pride at the door." Guests were forbidden from standing up when she entered the room. They had to act as if she were just another guest, not the all-powerful Empress of Russia. This was the demand of Catherine the Great, and her special retreat was the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Catherine was a formidable and brilliant ruler, but she despised the stiff, formal etiquette of traditional court life. She found it boring and stifling, so she created her own world with its own paradoxical set of rules. The main demand for her, Hermitage evenings, was a forced informality. This was, in its own way, just as stressful for her guests and servants as the most rigid court protocol. Everyone who entered was expected to shed their public persona. High-ranking generals had to play silly parlor games. Dignified ambassadors had to participate in amateur theatricals, and no one was allowed to defer to the Empress. This created a very strange situation for her servants. Their entire training was based on a system of deference. They were taught to be invisible, to anticipate the needs of their superiors, and to always show respect for rank. Now, they had to work at a party where all of that was forbidden. Imagine being a footman serving drinks at a hermitage party. The Empress walks into the room, your every instinct screams at you to stand straighter, to bow your head slightly, to avert your gaze. But you cannot. The rules of the Hermitage forbid it. You have to act naturally, as if the most powerful woman in the world is just another person in the room. It required an incredible amount of self-control. The guests felt the pressure too. They were terrified of making a mistake. What if he accidentally stood up when Catherine entered? What if he used her formal title? There was a penalty system for breaking the rules of informality. The punishment was usually to do something silly like recite a poem or drink a glass of water, but the social embarrassment was the real deterrent. You had to perform at being relaxed and casual, which is the least relaxing and casual thing a person can do. Catherine's demand for this atmosphere was about her own needs. She was an intellectual, and she wanted to be able to have real, open conversations with the artists, writers, and philosophers she invited. She knew that if everyone was constantly bowing and scraping, genuine discussion would be impossible. The Hermitage was her sanctuary, a place where she could be Catherine the person, not Catherine the Empress. But this sanctuary was maintained by servants who could never truly relax. They had to manage the logistics of the party, the food, the drink, the lighting, all while navigating this bizarre, upside-down social world. They had to know who all the important guests were, but pretend they didn't. They had to serve the Empress, but pretend she wasn't the Empress. The no rules rule was, in fact, the strictest rule of all. It was a demand to participate in a carefully constructed illusion, an illusion of equality and friendship in a world that was built on absolute hierarchy. Catherine's servants had to be brilliant actors, playing their part in a performance where the main audience was the Empress herself. They had to go along with her desire to escape her own power, even as they were constantly reminded of it in everything they did. Number 3. Could you be forced to live in a fairy tale? A queen grew tired of being a queen. She wanted to experience the simple, rustic life of a peasant, but she didn't want to give up her comforts. So she ordered a fake peasant village to be built in the gardens of her palace. It had a farmhouse, a dairy, a mill, and a barn. She and her ladies-in-waiting would go there and dress up in specially designed, idealized peasant costumes made of silk and muslin. They would pretend to be milkmaids and shepherdesses. This was the world of Marie Antoinette's Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet, built in the park of the Palace of Versailles. It was one of the most famous and controversial royal demands ever made. It was a demand for a fantasy life, and an army of servants was required to maintain the illusion. The hamlet was a fully functioning farm, but it was an idealized storybook version. The buildings were designed by a famous architect to look charmingly rustic, complete with thatched roofs and quaint details. But inside they were elegantly furnished. The animals, cows, sheep, goats were chosen for their beauty. They were washed and groomed daily, their horns sometimes decorated with ribbons. The queen's demand was to play at being a commoner without any of the actual hardship. When she visited her hamlet, she and her friends would don their peasant outfits. These were not made of rough wool, but of the finest fabrics created by the top dressmakers in Paris. The servants were the real workers who made this fantasy possible. Real farmers and dairymaids were employed to do the actual dirty work of running the farm. They would milk the cows and churn the butter. But when the queen and her party arrived, a different performance began. Specially made porcelain milk pails from the famous Sèvres factory would be brought out. The dairymaids would have already filled them with fresh, clean milk. Marie Antoinette would then milk a cow that had already been milked, or churn butter that had already been churned. She was acting out a pantomime of farm life. Imagine being one of the real dairymaids. You get up at dawn to do the hard physical labor of your job. Later in the day, the queen arrives in a beautiful, clean dress. Your job is to hand her a pristine porcelain bucket and watch her pretend to do your work for 10 minutes before she goes back to her palace for a multi-course dinner. You are a living prop in her elaborate game. The gardeners had to ensure the fields and vegetable patches were always perfectly manicured, looking productive but never messy. The mill had to be functional, but it was used to grind flour for special cakes for the queen, not bread for the village. Every aspect of the hamlet was carefully curated to provide a perfect, sanitized experience of rural life. Why did she make such a strange demand? Marie Antoinette felt trapped by the suffocating etiquette of Versailles. The court was a public stage where her every move was watched. The hamlet was her escape, a place where she felt she could be more natural and free. It was inspired by the philosophical ideas of the time, which romanticized nature and the simple life. But to the people of France, who were facing real poverty and hunger, the Queen's expensive fantasy village seemed like a grotesque mockery of their suffering. It became a symbol of her being out of touch with her subjects. The story, likely untrue, that she said, "Let them eat cake," fits perfectly with the image of a queen who played at being poor in her own private theme park. For her servants, the demand was to maintain a lie. They had to work on a real farm that was also a stage set. They had to facilitate the queen's role-playing, to pretend along with her that she was a simple milkmaid. They were the invisible hands that kept the fantasy alive, allowing their queen to escape into a world that was nothing like the one her people were actually living in. Number 2, how do you make a queen look like a goddess? A queen demanded a look that was pure, virginal, and almost supernatural. To achieve this, she caked her face in a thick, white makeup called Venetian ceruse. Her maids would apply it every day, covering her face, neck, and chest in a smooth, white mask. The makeup gave her the desired look. It also happened to be made from white lead and vinegar. It was poison. This was the signature look of Queen Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen. Her image was one of the most powerful political tools she possessed. In a world dominated by men, she needed to project an image of timeless authority and otherworldly purity. Her demand was for a face that looked less like a person and more like an icon, and her servants had to help her create it, at great personal risk to the Queen. The daily makeup ritual was a central part of Elizabeth's routine. Her ladies-in-waiting would prepare the cerus, a thick paste. They would carefully apply it, layer by layer, until every wrinkle, blemish, and sign of age was obliterated. Over this white base, they would add a bright red blush to her cheeks and paint her lips with a cochineal-based dye. To complete the look, they would pluck her hairline to create a fashionably high forehead and pencil in thin, arched eyebrows. The effect was dramatic. It made her look pale and regal, like a living statue. But the main ingredient, white lead, was a deadly neurotoxin. The prolonged use would eat away at the skin, causing scarring, discoloration, and decay. The more damage it did, the more makeup was needed to cover it up, creating a vicious cycle. It could also cause hair loss, digestive problems, and eventually organ failure. Imagine being one of Elizabeth's ladies in waiting. You are painting poison onto your queen's face every single day. You see the damage it is doing to her skin underneath. But you cannot say anything. The queen demands this look. It is her armor. To question it would be to question her image, and therefore her power. So you continue the ritual, knowing that you are contributing to her slow poisoning. Removing the makeup was an equally hazardous process. Like, it was so thick that it was often left on for a week at a time. To take it off required a harsh concoction, sometimes containing mercury, another deadly poison. So the process of applying and removing the makeup was a double dose of toxicity. Elizabeth's demand for this specific look was about more than vanity. It was propaganda. As she aged, she became more and more reliant on the illusion of youth and vigor. Her portraits from late in her reign show a flat, ageless mask, not a real person. She was crafting an image of a queen who was above time, above decay, and therefore fit to rule. The demand extended to everyone at court. They were expected to praise her beauty and her youthful appearance, even as she grew old and frail. To mention her age or her deteriorating looks would be political suicide. Her courtiers and servants were all part of a conspiracy of flattery, a performance designed to prop up the queen's carefully constructed image. Her control over her image was absolute. She became furious if she saw an unflattering portrait of herself. The demand was that she only be depicted in the way she wanted to be seen as Gloriana, the ageless virgin queen. The servants who mixed her cosmetics and applied her makeup were the secret keepers of her true appearance. They saw the reality behind the mask. They saw the aging woman, the scarred skin, the effects of the poison. But their job was to create the illusion. They had to go along with the demand that was both bizarre and dangerous, helping their queen to build a face that would define an era, even as it was slowly killing her. Number 1. Did a queen have a secret king? A widowed queen retreated from public life, consumed by grief. She refused to see her ministers or perform her duties. But she found comfort in the company of one specific servant, a rough-hewn Scottish gillie from the Highlands. She demanded his constant presence. He spoke to her bluntly, without the usual court flattery. He became her closest companion, her confidant, and her protector. Their relationship was so close and so scandalous that the court began to call her Mrs. Brown. Okay? This was the relationship between Queen Victoria and John Brown. After the death of her beloved Prince Albert, Victoria was lost. She plunged into the deep mourning that would define the rest of her life. But a few years into her widowhood, she summoned a servant from her Scottish estate, Balmoral, to work at Windsor. His name was John Brown. Brown was the opposite of everything the stuffy English court represented. He was plain-spoken, opinionated, and had no time for protocol. And Victoria adored him for it. Her demand, which shocked and appalled the court and her own family, was for John Brown's constant companionship. He became her personal attendant. He led her pony on her daily rides. He was in charge of her personal safety. But his role went far beyond that of a normal servant. He was the only person who could tell the queen what to do. He would scold her if he thought she wasn't dressed warmly enough. He would call her woman to her face. While everyone else had to walk on eggshells around the grieving monarch, Brown treated her like a normal person. This created an impossible situation for the other servants and the courtiers. The official hierarchy of the court was turned upside down. This common, uneducated Scottish servant had more access to the queen and more influence over her than the prime minister. Imagine being a lady in waiting or a high-ranking official. You have to go through a dozen layers of protocol to speak to the queen. But John Brown can walk into her private rooms unannounced. He gives her orders and she obeys. He controls who gets to see her. If Brown didn't like you, you had no chance of getting an audience. The entire court had to learn to go through John Brown. They had to be polite to a man they considered to be a coarse and arrogant upstart, all because the queen demanded it. The relationship fueled endless gossip. Were they secretly married? Were they lovers? There is no definitive evidence, but the rumors were rampant. The scandal was not just that the queen was close to a servant, but that he was a commoner, and that their intimacy was so public and so defiant. Victoria's children were particularly horrified. They saw Brown's influence as a threat. Her eldest son, the future Edward VII, detested him. But they were powerless. Victoria's demand for Brown's presence was non-negotiable. He was her link to her beloved Albert, who had also admired the honesty of the Scottish people. He was her rock, her protector, and perhaps the only person she felt she could truly be herself with. She commissioned portraits and sculptures of him. She wrote about him glowingly in her diaries. When he died in 1883, she was devastated, writing that her life was once again lonely and desolate. She wanted to publish a biography of him, but was persuaded not to by her advisors who feared it would cause an even greater scandal. The demand to accept John Brown was perhaps the weirdest and most profound of Victoria's reign. It wasn't about a strange ritual or a physical object. It was a demand to accept a complete subversion of the social order. She forced her aristocratic court and her own royal family to defer to a man they despised. They had to go along with it because the alternative was to alienate the most powerful woman in the world, a queen who had found a new, and very unlikely, king for her lonely castle.